Thanks, Jeremy. Cool. So, hey everyone. Alex Huth. I've met many of you over the past couple of days. So this talk is going to be a little bit like strangely organized. I wasn't really sure how to do this because I'm running like a tutorial this afternoon, so I wanted to give you guys relevant information for that. So there's going to be one part of this that's like science, like this is the science stuff that I'm doing, have done. It's a little bit older, but I think interesting. One part of it is going to be a little bit more didactic, like here's how we fit these models, or at least looking at one important part that I usually sort of elide when I talk about the kinds of modeling work that I do. And then one part is going to be a little bit newer, and it's work that we do on sort of critical analysis of methods that are used in the community. So I think that should be interesting and maybe spur some conversation. So, let me begin. The sort of basic question that I'm interested in is, we listen to words, we listen to someone speaking to us. These words go into our brain, something happens. We get some sort of idea that captures the meaning of the words that somebody's saying to you. Like this is happening right now. You have some idea in your head that's representing this idea of having an idea in your head based on words that somebody's saying to you. And I want to understand what is sort of the format of that representation, like what's happening inside your brain to represent a thought as it's occurring, or sort of the format of an idea. And how does this transformation happen from words to ideas, and maybe the other way around too. So this is a massive, like, impossible question. So we're going to break it down into a sort of simpler part and look at sort of basic analyses of how this might happen in the brain. So I'm going to describe to you first one experiment that was now published a couple years ago, but this is sort of illustrating nicely this idea of natural stimuli and what we can do with natural stimuli, I think. So this experiment is, we had people lay in the scanner and just listen to stories. So is anybody familiar with the Moth radio hour? The Moth, okay, so a few people. So this is, I guess the Moth radio hour is a radio show that's distributed by PRI. Sometimes I say NPR, and then I met the Moth people and they're like, no. NPR is like the Death Star of the public radio world, so PRI, very, very specific. The Moth is like a storytelling theater in New York where people get up on stage and they tell true autobiographical stories, so true stories about their own lives. They're naturally spoken, so it's somebody just sort of speaking off the cuff. They've practiced telling these stories. But one interesting thing that I learned talking to the people at the Moth is they maintain the naturalness of the speech by not letting their performers ever write the stories down. So they say, like, you are never allowed to write down the story. Like, not even, you can't have notes on stage, but like you should never ever write it down at all. They write down like the first sentence and the last sentence, but then everything in between has to be like in your head. And what this leads to is this very natural performance where instead of somebody saying words that sound like they've been constructed and written and whatever, they're speaking off the cuff in this natural way, which has interesting syntactic differences from written language. So when we speak off the cuff, we tend to use simpler grammatical constructions. There's no sentence boundaries. You just string things together with the word and. You can never segment this stuff into reasonable sentences, which is kind of a disaster for applying some NLP methods to these data. But yeah, so it leads to this really a certain feel for the data, and we don't necessarily take advantage of that, but I just think it's really interesting to think about like what makes this natural, and actually what efforts the people who constructed these stimuli for us, put on this fantastic radio show, what efforts they made to make this engaging for their audience. So this is a really simple experiment. There's no task that the subjects have to do. They just close their eyes and listen to stories. It's extremely pleasant, actually. This is something that you might do on a day-to-day basis anyway. Just close your eyes and listen to a radio show. This is by far like the most fun experiment that I've ever been a subject in. It's pretty cool. And I think that also makes a difference in the kind of data that you get out of these things, is like how engaged your subjects are in your stimuli and how sort of interested they are, rather than I've done a lot of experiments that are like staring at essentially a blinking dot for 2 hours, and that sucks. Like that's extremely different kind of experience. Okay, so that's the experiment. I'm going to show you a bunch of flattened brain images, and I want to illustrate sort of where that comes from, so that you can understand what this looks like. So this is a high-resolution T1 anatomical of somebody's brain. We use this to extract a 3D model of their cortical surface, as many of you are familiar with. We can inflate the surface so that we can see down inside the sulci. We can make relaxation cuts into the surface, and then we can flatten out the surface so that we can see the entire cortex in one two-dimensional view. And this is very useful, just sort of convenient way to see the entire cortex all at once. I'm a very corticocentric person, so I'm only going to show you pictures of cortex, but I guess there are other parts of the brain. But so the way to read this is that this is the left hemisphere, obviously this is the right hemisphere. This is the visual cortex, is right here in the middle. One note too, so we've outlined some areas in white lines here. These are sort of known brain areas that we've defined based on other localizer scans. So each of our subjects has gone through a sort of big battery of localizers, including a lot of retinotopic scans and motor localizers, auditory cortex localizer, like object category localizers, a sort of standard battery of things that we established in the field, and so we can have these areas that everybody talks about. We can define those areas on a per subject basis. But so this is visual cortex in the back of the brain right here. We actually define this cut based on the center of V1. So we have this like V1, V2, V3, V4 stripes right here. There's visual areas arrayed around it. This is auditory cortex and sort of lateral temporal lobe right here. This is the Sylvian fissure, this Y-shaped gray thing. This is the somatomotor strip. So this is the mouth areas, hand areas, foot areas, and then premotor areas up here, supplementary motor areas here. This is like a IPS, high-level visual areas. But you can see that there's a lot of the brain here that is mystery meat, right? That doesn't have white lines around it, that isn't defined as rigorously or talked about as rigorously in the community as these sort of known, well-defined functional areas. And a lot of what we're going to be seeing and talking about today has to do with those areas. So let me show you what some of this data looks like. A caveat here. So this is data from one subject, and the stimuli here, these are actually not moth stories. This is a slightly different data set that we used for like testing these models. It's not actually used in any of the analyses that I'm going to show you today, but they're like 15-second snippets of stories that are actually being read. So you might notice that they're not as natural as you might think. But you're going to see the activity on this brain right here. So sort of that will follow along with the words as the story goes on. And the game that we're going to play is we're going to try to match what the words are that appear here to the activity. So we're going to try to predict, when does this part become red? Like which words, or what kind of content in the story causes each part of the brain to become red, which is high activity, or blue, which is low activity. So let me just show you what this looks like real quick.
The world we're bringing our children into.
Can you guys hear that?
I thought it sounded like the kind of statement that brings people closer together, pointing as it did to their common fate. But the sexy mom just glared at him and took the healthy living supplement too, without asking.
He put Lily in charge of the party while he was gone, and then he walked downstairs. There must have been 5,000 people milling around, wrapped in furs or long overcoats or ski parkas, leather jackets, high school, college kids, heavily champagne 60-year-olds, linking arms and singing.
Only the 2 front windows with white shades lowered were not somehow blanketed. Your eye was constantly drawn to where the material converged mid-ceiling, punctured by a dazzling pink spotlight that looked like it might have just vaporized a flamingo. See?
Okay, so you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? You get these big coordinated like bursts of activity that happen in cortex. Often they're bilaterally matched areas that come on at certain times, but what the heck are they actually doing? So that's what the analyses that I'm going to do are trying to figure out. So the basic technique that I use, and this has been developed over the past decade roughly in Jack Gallant's lab at Berkeley, is called voxel-wise modeling. So what this means is that we're going to fit an an individual model to each voxel of our data. We're going to treat them exactly the way that electrophysiologists of yore treat single neurons, which is ridiculous because a voxel is many neurons. But if we do this, then good things happen. So let me tell you how this works. So we take some natural stimuli. We've talked about that. Play them for our subject and record fMRI data. We're just recording data continuously while the subjects are listening to these stimuli. Then we take the same stimuli, we project them into some hypothesized feature space. And this is actually kind of where the science happens here, right? So the standard like hypothesis tests, whatever scientific, that thing we do, science. So this is where that happens here. So there's no hypothesis embedded in the stimuli themselves. We're just saying like something happens in the brain when you listen to language. Like that's incontrovertible. But what we're doing here is we're extracting some features from the stimuli that we think the brain might actually represent, right? So we have some hypothesis about which features in the stimuli might be important for the brain or might be causing certain parts of the brain to become active. And we're going to pull those features out of the stimuli. And I'm going to talk about, I guess, 2 examples of that in a moment. So once we have these features and we have the fMRI data, we can do this voxel-wise regression model estimation, which means that we're going to, for each voxel, estimate a model that predicts the response of that voxel as a function of these features. Okay, this is just straight up linear regression. I'll talk more about how this works in a moment. Stage 2, we're going to take new natural stimuli, play them for our subject, get new fMRI data. We're going to project these stimuli into our feature space using the same method that we used before. And then we're going to take the regression models that we fit in the estimation stage, and we're going to use them to predict the new data. Okay? This is, I feel like in computer science, this is like a very natural thing to do, but in like neuroscience and psychology, this is still kind of weird. The idea that you would predict new data that's out of set, but I think that's really important for being able to measure whether these models actually work in sort of an unbiased way. So we're going to predict this data that the model hasn't seen before. This data wasn't used to train the model. And then we can test how well the prediction works. We can compute like the correlation between a predicted time course for a voxel and the actual time course that we record. And if it works well, then we can go one step further and try to interpret what's actually going on in these voxels. So we can try to interpret, if this model works well, which features have high weights for this voxel. So which features are actually driving the response in this voxel. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that as well. So let's start with a really simple model. This is sort of a straw man model, but I think it illustrates the point nicely. So our simple model is going to be that each voxel responds some amount to each word. Now what that means is that essentially every time you hear a word, every time you hear the word chair, or every time you hear the word penguin, every voxel in your brain is going to have a little like boop, up response, down response, no response, something, right? This is a dumb model, but bear with me for a second here. So mathematically, this is saying that the sort of response time course of a voxel, this R of t, we're going to be modeling that as a weighted sum of these word indicator variables. So these are variables that are just 1 when a word is present and 0 when a word is not present. We have n words in this case. And for each word, we have a weight, that's this beta I, that says how much this voxel is affected by the presence of that word. Okay, straightforward. Now we know R because we record it with a fMRI, whatever procedure. We know W because we've annotated all these stimuli. We know every word that is spoken in the stories. We know exactly when every word is spoken. So the only thing that we need to figure out here is beta, right? This is regression. This is linear regression. I'm going to frame that here as a sort of Bayesian regression problem, which is going to set up something I'm going to do later. But this is essentially just another way to think about linear regression, is that we have some likelihood function that gives us a probability of the observed response given our betas, the weights, and the word indicator variables W. And we're going to try to find the betas that maximize this likelihood function. Okay? If we assume that this likelihood function is Gaussian, this is linear regression precisely. Okay, so we fit these betas. For every voxel, we get a bunch of betas that says like which words does that voxel respond to and how much does it respond to each word. And then we test this model in held out data. So the held out data here is going to be one whole story. It's about a 10-minute story that the subject hadn't seen before, the model hadn't seen before. And we're going to predict for each voxel the time course. So this is about 300 time points. And then we're going to take the correlation between the predicted and actual time courses. And that looks like this. So here I'm showing the correlation. This is just Pearson correlation. For each voxel, I'm thresholding by significance. So voxels that are shown as the sort of underlying curvature map are not significant. But we get reasonable prediction performance through a pretty big chunk of cortex here. So especially in sort of lateral auditory cortex and throughout, this is lateral inferior temporal cortex, parietal cortex, medial parietal cortex, and a bit in prefrontal cortex, we get decent prediction performance with this model. I'm calling this mediocre, but you haven't seen a better model yet, maybe. So yeah. Okay, so let's assume that we think this model doesn't work very well. How can we improve it? What kind of stuff can we add to this really dumb model to make it, to make it do a better job? So one thing that I'm interested in, as I alluded to in the beginning, is meaning, right? So I want to get at how the meaning of language is represented in cortex. So as an improved model, what if we assume that we should see similar responses to words that have similar meanings? Okay, I think this is like a pretty sensible idea. So here's just an example of what that might look like. So if we have words like month, week, and year, these all have to do with spans of time. And we might expect that if a voxel responds a lot to the word week, it should also respond to the word month and the word hour. All right. Similar for like park, building, and location, woman, boy, child. But we don't know that a voxel, if it responds a lot to hour, that it should also respond a lot to building. Like there's no reason to sort of suspect that a priori. So you might ask, how do we get these similarity judgments? How do we know which words have similar meanings? So we're going to rely on some techniques from computational linguistics. There's this old idea called the distributional hypothesis, that you shall know a word by the company it keeps. And the idea here is basically that words that appear together in text, or words that have similar patterns of co-occurrence in text, have related meanings. So you can look across a large corpus of text of how people use these words, and then compare them in some way statistically, and that can tell you about the relationships between their meanings. The way that we actually do that is this, which is a bit ad hoc, but it turns out to work quite well and is very similar to sort of state-of-the-art methods in the field right now. So what we do is we have a lexicon. These are all the words that appear in the stories and some other words. This is about 10,500 words. For each of the words in our lexicon, we're going to go through our corpus and we're going to count how often it co-occurs with each of the words in this set of target words. So we have a set of about 1,000 target words, and these are just common English words. Okay, these are common English concepts. They're not quite the 1,000 most common words in English, but they're something like that. So essentially, we get a score for each word in our lexicon that's, how often does it co-occur with difficult, how often does it co-occur with husband, potato, remember, etc. Right? And then the way that we're going to judge similarities between two words is we're going to take the dot products of their vectors here. So we're going to take dot products over this 985-dimensional space, and that's going to tell us, that's going to give us essentially this information that tells us how similar the words are. So if you think about this, what this kind of corresponds to is we're asking how similar are the patterns of co-occurrence for two words, right? So if you think of a word like carrot and a word like peas, right? Both of these words are going to have probably low co-occurrence with difficult. There's nothing particularly difficult about carrots or peas. Remember, I don't know, I mean, you can talk about remembering carrots or peas, but that's probably not higher than like background rate of things co-occurring with remember. But potato, like probably carrots and peas both, they co-occur quite a lot with potato. So because they would both have a high value for the sort of potato row in this matrix, the dot product between the carrots vector and the peas vector would be high, and that would tell us that carrots and peas have some related meaning. All right. Now this seems weird. This seems ad hoc. This seems like, okay, we have these vectors that represent something about what words mean. Like, what does that actually do? What can that do? This has insanely cool properties that people have started to elucidate. this is, I'm sort of drawing from something that was done with another method called word2vec, but it works equally well. This is showing data using the method that I've just described to you. So it has these properties of like transforming analogies into vectors in this 985 dimensional space. So for example, if we take, here I just pulled out 10 words from my lexicon. Beijing, Moscow, Berlin, London, Paris, China, Russia, Germany, France, England. I make a little matrix that's like 10 by 985. Do principal components analysis on that matrix to bring it down to 2 dimensions, so it's like 10 by 2. And then just plot the locations of each of these 10 points in this 2D PC space. What you can see is that we actually have this reasonably consistent relationship between the location of a country and its capital in this space. What that means is that we can do operations like we can learn that there's one vector that if you add it to a country, you get a new vector that sort of corresponds to that country's capital, which is cool. This is interesting. So this has some sort of nice linearity properties for capturing meaning. One thing that you might notice here too is that even though we're just looking at co-occurrences of words, we're just looking at like how words are used in text, right? I used like a huge corpus, like billions of words of text to train this model. But this model, it's never seen a globe. It's never seen a map of the world. And yet, if you look along this axis right here, essentially we have like a geographical axis in this space, right? We go from west over here to east over here. So it actually learns things about the structure of the world. Like information about the structure of the world is embedded into this space, into these vectors that we learn for these words. Okay, I just wanted to convince you that like this word vector approach is interesting and sort of can teach us interesting information. So how do we actually use this? So we're going to, again, this is our improved model, is that we expect that there will be similar responses to words with similar meanings. We're just going to sort of instantiate this idea as regression with a prior. Okay, so whereas before we were finding the regression weights beta that maximized this likelihood function, that's just the probability of the responses, et cetera, we're going to tweak this function. So instead of just maximizing the likelihood, we're going to maximize the product of the likelihood function and a prior function, p of beta, that's going to assign a high probability to weights that obey this pattern, so where like a month and week are similar, and low probability to sets of weights that disobey this pattern. Okay? This is generally a method called like Tikhonov regression. Okay, I can talk about particulars of this later, but that's essentially all we're doing here. Is we're giving the model a little extra information. We're giving it a little extra juice that says, okay, like make these things a little more similar than you would otherwise. I want to mention that this is not representational similarity analysis. It has a flavor of that. You're seeing like a stimulus by stimulus relationship matrix. So I'm going to talk more about this later. Okay, so we fit this model, we test it on our held out data, and the performance is much better than it was when we fit the model on individual words. So we have many more voxels that are predicted with much higher correlation than before. I can flip back and forth between these. So this is the word-only model. This is the semantic model that captures all the semantic information about the relationships between words. We're now doing a fantastic job of predicting medial parietal cortex, a lot of prefrontal cortex, a lot of lateral parietal cortex. There's a lot of stuff that we can predict with this semantic model. So we can take this, so this is just showing the correlations on a 3D brain. So the way that I interpret this is because we're taking information about what these words mean, and that's improving our model, that these brain areas represent something about meaning. That's the sort of inference that I'm making here. Yes? So we include like a number of nuisance regressors in this. We don't include motion, but I've done that too, and that doesn't really factor in here or strongly. Our subjects tend to be pretty good at not moving because they're like very practiced people in the lab. We do regress out things like the number of words per TR, so that's like another factor that we include. The number of phonemes per TR and some like phonemic information to sort of take out lower level stuff. It turns out that doesn't actually matter too much. That helps explain out some stuff in like early auditory cortex, but not much otherwise. Yeah.
So when you say the second approach performs better, seems like if you see more voxels being able to kind of contain useful information about what words people are looking at, you count that as better. But how, like, would the best model say everywhere in the brain represents words? Like, what about a finger tapping neuron that only cares about, I don't know, if such neurons exist, but
Sure. I mean,
that is a good thing or a bad thing, or do you think everything represents everything? Or
no. So we can sort of actually rigorously define like a noise ceiling for each voxel, which is like how good a model could we ever hope to have for this voxel, and we can do that by playing the same stimulus twice or multiple times to somebody, and then asking how repeatable are the responses across those presentations, and that tells us generally like which parts of the brain respond to the stimulus at all, and then which parts respond, more consistently or less consistently. So we can use that to sort of segregate out parts that we would never expect the model to work at all, and parts where we would expect it to work, but we can't explain that yet. Although it's still hard to say like, what. I don't know if we could say when we've reached the best model, but we can say that one model is better than another if it predicts more. I think that's safe and kind of uncontroversial. Okay, so let's quickly go through this this sort of third stage of voxelized modeling, which is the model interpretation. So we want to know, we know that these models work, they fit well, they can predict what these voxels are going to do when you listen to a new story. So what kind of information is captured by each voxel? One thing we can do is just look at one voxel and then ask which words make this voxel activate or deactivate. This voxel is in the sort of inferior prefrontal cortex of one subject. It really likes words like 8 miles maximum upwards nearly. This is like the M&M voxel, right? It really doesn't like words like politics and religion and et cetera. But this is, we can form some story about what this voxel is doing, but that's tricky and it's kind of mushy and unclear what's happening. And this is one well-predicted voxel out of thousands of well-predicted voxels in each subject, and we have multiple subjects. One thing, I don't know if I made this clear before, these models are all fit on an individual subject basis. I'm not doing any combination of data across subjects with anything that you've seen so far. Everything is like within subject, we learn a model, we predict on other data from that subject. So how do we do this? How do we sort of see at a glance what's happening in these models? So I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I'll give you the shrinklet version, which is that we're going to reduce the dimensionality of the models down from 1,000 or thousands of dimensions to just 3 using principal components analysis just to find like the sort of major axes of variation across the brain. And then we can represent those 3 dimensions as colors, and then we can look at the whole brain all at once with this kind of display. So here I've coded, so each voxel has a projection on the first, second, and third principal components in this space. And I turn those 3 projections into an RGB color. So the first PC determines the redness, second PC the greenness, and third PC the blueness of the color. You can see that in this little cube here. And so what we can see is that these sort of well-predicted regions of the brain, so we have this sort of lateral parietal cortex, temporal cortex, medial parietal cortex, prefrontal cortex, there's a lot of structure here to what's going on, right? So, so one easy takeaway is that voxels that have similar colors or the same color tend to respond to similar sets of words. And those words, I've given you a sort of little schematic up here that shows broadly what these colors mean. So for instance, green corresponds to sort of visual, tactile, numeric properties. Visual, tactile, numeric words, so words that describe sort of visual aspects of things. Pink, sort of red-pink color, sort of captures words that have social or emotional content, so words that describe people or relationships between people or sort of emotional states that people have. And that's really the sort of main axis of distinction along here. So we have a lot of green areas and red areas here that sort of lie along this first principal component. So I want to point out here that one thing that I thought was extremely surprising about this data. So notice that almost all of the places that we can predict well and that we can sort of map out using this approach are in the mystery meat, right? They're outside of the sort of known areas that we talk about. And the thing that I was blown away by was actually in prefrontal cortex, right? There's which is this big, complicated, like God knows what it does, like real mystery meat part of the brain. We actually see this pretty nice structure, that they're patches of cortex that do specific things, and they're next to other patches of cortex that do other specific things. And it seems like there's a lot of pretty nice structure to the representations are very organized in prefrontal cortex. And that was something that I was excited about to see this data. So the sort of even cooler thing is that if we look across subjects, so this is now 3 different subjects, this is the left hemisphere of each, and this is the whole brains for each. If that goes away, you can see that there's actually quite a bit of consistent structure between these subjects. So I'm not going to move the mouse because that brings back that bar. But the broad structure. So there's a big red patch in the TPJ. There's sort of this green ring around it, and then running down the inferior temporal cortex. That's there in every one of these subjects. There's even consistency in these patterns in prefrontal cortex, right? So there's these sort of along the inferior frontal sulcus and gyrus, intercalated by these sort of yellow and pink patches here, and we can see the same kind of pattern-ish here, same pattern here. We see this big blue blob in the middle right there with a little red patch behind it. There's a lot of sort of detailed structure in these maps that's really consistent across. And that's interesting. That was exciting, especially in these mystery meat parts of the brain that are harder to describe, harder to explain using standard approaches. Yeah. That's totally a possibility. So this is one of the sort of issues with using natural stimuli, right? That there are these correlations exist. But we have something to combat that we've already employed here, which is regression. So regression is really the process of taking things that are correlated and then pulling them apart and asking, what part of this response is actually explained by one thing that can't be explained by another, or how do we factor apart these kinds of responses? So to the degree that we actually have encoded the variables of interest here, which are we've encoded pretty broadly all the semantic content in these stories, I think we're doing a good job at pulling those things apart here. The really more dangerous thing, I think, is asking, are there variables that we have not encoded in our regression models that might be correlated with these variables and that might be causing these things to happen? So we've explored a lot of different things to look at that. One thing that I was really worried about was sort of prosodic information, so tone of voice or something like that. Maybe that encodes emotional information. And I was really worried for a while that a lot of these places that seem to be, especially this lateral auditory cortex stuff, it really has a few areas that are strongly selected for emotional words. I was worried that this must be something about the voice that we're just not coding here. But then we went back and we did a follow-up experiment. We had subjects read these stories instead of listen to them, and the maps are identical. They're identical. You would be hard-pressed to tell the difference between them. And that means that it's definitely not any sort of tone of voice thing. It is really related to the content. So I don't know, that helps. But this is always something you have to think about. It's always something you have to think about with any experiment that you carefully design too. There are always correlations between things in your stimuli and things that you have not designed for. One of the nice things about natural stimuli is that they tend to vary in every possible dimension. So you have a hope of decorrelating these things someday. If you can come up with a way to label this new feature that you think might be correlated with your stuff, you can include that in your regression model and you can factor it out. But if you have a carefully designed experiment, it'll often be the case that whatever that new feature is that might be driving your responses, or whatever might be a confound for your experiment, it's baked into the design. So you often actually can't decorrelate it if it's sort of fundamentally correlated with one of your variables. Okay, so I'm going to move on to how much time do I have left? Right. Okay. We'll blast through this. So you guys are going to do a lab this afternoon that is sort of running through this analysis. And there's one part of this that I always just sort of skip over and don't talk about because it's complicated, but I think it's actually really interesting and really important, and it's going to be a part of what you do today. So I wanted to sort of briefly talk through that. And that's the way that we actually do spatiotemporal modeling here. So fMRI, we're recording the bold signal. It's not neural data. you need to account for the hemodynamic response function, right? This fact that when you have an impulse of neural activity or something happening in the brain, you get a bold signal that rises and then falls over the course of many seconds. So this HRF, it definitely needs to be accounted for in the model. There are three approaches that one is to assume the HRF. I think this is really bad. We can show that it's bad in our data. If we fit these same models with assumed HRFs, you would be stunned at how poorly they do at predicting new data. Different voxels, it turns out, actually do have different HRFs. Different people have different HRFs. This is crucial. You can fit what's called a space-time separable model, or you can fit what's called a space-time inseparable model. And let me talk about this really briefly. So space-time separable model, this is sort of, I think, what everybody's picture in their head is of what an HRF actually is. So this is like, mathematically, your model is the outer product of one spatial kernel and one temporal kernel. You can fit this using methods like generalized least squares. You generally have to fit each voxel separately, which are sort of some downsides. But the way it looks is this. So the idea is here, you have, for one voxel, you have one HRF. This is the shape of the HRF for this voxel. And then you have, so this is the time component. And then you also have what this voxel cares about. So this is the space component. This axis here, it might be anything. It might be like semantic vectors. It might be different words that the voxel cares about. It might be different locations in visual space, whatever your like actual features of interest are. So this voxel cares some amount about each of these features. Has some weight for each of these features. And then if you looked at how the voxel responds actually to each of these features, essentially you take the outer product of these two matrices. You get this matrix that looks like this. So for each feature, you have this kernel weighted by the value of the feature, right? So you have a negative dip here, a big positive bump there, something like that. So this is called a space-time separable model. And when you look at this matrix, it has rank 1 because you can exactly decompose it into these two vectors. So this is one way to do this. Turns out this is hard, and we're not actually going to do this. We're going to do something that's a little bit weirder and is not actually how people usually think about HRFs, which we call a space-time inseparable model. So the idea here is that we're actually going to fit a different temporal kernel for each feature. Okay, which sounds crazy. This sounds like a lot of weights. Turns out that this works super well in practice. This is an example of what this might look like. So this is, again, we have time, we have space. Now we have a different HRF for each feature. Maybe a lot of these are noisy, maybe some are junk, but maybe some of them have this very sort of sharp structure in them. It turns out that these two work about as well. Sorry, I'll get there. So the differences between these are that the separable model is, although it makes more sense, it's absurdly expensive to fit. It's highly constrained, which is, I think, maybe gives it a little bit better properties as a model, whereas the inseparable model is super cheap to fit and more unconstrained. In practice, they perform extremely similarly. So this is some data from Amar Nunez in Jack Allen's lab showing separable model performance along this axis, inseparable model performance along this axis. Each dot here, I think this is actually those are actual dots. Yeah, so each dot here is a different voxel in I think one subject's brain. And you can see that the performance of the two is almost identical. I don't think this means that actually each feature has a different HRF. Like, that's probably not true. It's probably more true that each voxel has an HRF and that you use that across many features. But the fact that they work so similarly means that I think we should just rely on the easier method. And so that's what you guys are actually going to use this afternoon, is the inseparable models. This is showing what the sort of, this was a model of visual cortex voxels, and this is showing the sort of receptive field for these voxels that you get from an inseparable versus a separable model. And you can see that they're small differences, but they're very similar overall. So let me say briefly how the inseparable model is actually fit, and this is what you guys are going to do. You're going to use something called a finite impulse response model. And what this comes down to is basically you take your stimulus matrix and you copy it a bunch of times, but each time you delay it a little bit. Okay, so you make this big stimulus matrix that is a concatenation of multiple copies of your original stimulus matrix, where each one is shifted by maybe one time point. So what that means is that if you look across one row, which is essentially like these are the data that we're using to predict the response at one time point, you are learning that response as a function of the stimuli at this time, the stimuli one time point previous, one time point previous, and one time point previous. So we can look at that like this. So essentially our response y of t is going to be some weighted combination of the stimulus maybe at this time point. We can choose what these delays are. One time point before, t minus 2, and t minus 3. So because we're learning separate weights for these weights will essentially learn the shape of the HRF, which can vary now across voxels, and this works extremely well. Okay, since I have a couple more minutes, I wanted to get into this last thing, which, yeah, let's do it. So I haven't actually really given this talk before, but I want to talk about it because I think it's important, and it's some work that we've been doing really recently. So again, this is actually work that I helped, but a lot of it is by Amor Nunez, and these figures are all his. So RSA representational similarity analysis is a technique that's pretty widely used in this like computational sort of fMRI field. And I want to talk a little bit about reasons that I think it's actually a dangerous technique to use and alternatives that you can use instead. So first, I want to start by saying that like RSA makes sense. It makes really intuitive sense. It's wonderfully easy to understand, and I think kind of therein lies its danger, but I just want to describe it if you aren't familiar with it. So the basic idea is we take some blob of voxels in the brain, we show a bunch of stimuli to this subject, and then we compute across this blob of voxels how similar are the patterns of response between stimuli. So this is like a stimulus by stimulus matrix. It's called a RSM, representational similarity matrix. And in this case, this is just an example, but we have some stimuli that are animate, some that are inanimate, and maybe all the animate ones are on average more similar to each other, the inanimate ones are more similar to each other, and there's sort of not much similarity between those two groups. This is a standard result. We have some computational model that gives us some RSM. It tells us sort of how similar should these things be according to some assumptions about how the world works. And maybe this says, okay, these are exactly similar, exactly dissimilar, exactly similar. In RSA, all you do is you extract sort of a triangle of this matrix, of these sort of correlations between responses, triangle of this thing, and then take the correlation between these two sets of data. You just vectorize both and then correlate them. Obviously, in this case, they should be highly correlated, right? This works. This tells you that like animate, inanimate is an important distinction for this piece of brain, right? This is some math showing exactly the same thing here. One thing that people have been doing a lot recently is using RSA with computational models that don't just tell you how similar things are, but give you features of each stimulus. So for example, here we have a set of stimuli. Our computational model extracts some set of features from these stimuli that, we have, I don't know, P features. It's a large vector of features. And then we convert this stimulus by feature matrix into a representational similarity matrix by just taking dot products between these, the vector for each stimulus, right? Or correlating the vectors for each stimulus. This is now a pretty common thing in the field. So we get this computational model RSM from here. And then you go through your RSA procedure like usual. Now, the thing that we sort of struck upon here is that RSA is actually, it's really similar to fitting a regression model. It's really similar to fitting an encoding model, right? So what I was talking about before is essentially you just take that feature matrix, you do regression to predict the responses in each voxel. So RSA is similar to that, except that you're making extremely strong prediction, or extremely strong assumptions about the structure of the weights that you fit, okay? So if the sort of underlying thing that's happening is that your stimulus-evoked responses are some linear projection of your features with some weights, your RSA matrix is essentially, what you're testing is whether YY transpose, this thing multiplied by itself, that's like the correlation matrix, is equal to or close to XX transpose, which is this feature matrix multiplied by itself. That's the standard sort of RSA thing. And if this is, if there's something underlying that looks like this, then what you're really seeing in your data, the sort of underlying model is that actually you don't have XX transpose over here. You have X times beta beta transpose times X transpose. That's just sort of this thing multiplied by itself transposed. And so this is sort of the truth, you might say, if this is like the underlying model. But this is actually what you're testing for in RSA. So when are these two things the same? They're only the same when your beta beta transpose, this sort of inner part here, this lambda b as we call it, is equal to the identity matrix. So that's the strong assumption of RSA, is that your sort of outer product of your weight matrix with itself is equal to identity. What does that mean? It means that for any pair of features, the weight vectors across the brain have to be orthogonal. So if you just pick two features and look at how they're represented across the brain, they have to have no relationship to each other. They have to be orthogonal. I'm going to tell you that that does not happen. That rarely ever happens. When I did this principal components analysis that I showed you earlier to look at the responses across, or to map out the responses across the brain in the speech data, we're specifically taking advantage of the fact that these are not orthogonal, right? The principal components are capturing the sort of covariant structure of these feature weights. So we know that this is not true. We know that there are patches of brain that even if there's a lot of fine detailed structure in them, like Jim showed yesterday, there are sort of large scale patterns that show up across these patches, and that's going to make this also not be true. Okay, so just to illustrate this, again, here's a voxels by features, a weight matrix that it looks random, and if it looks random like this, then you get often something that, this is the covariance matrix, which is identity. The assumptions are met. This is good for RSA. But what often happens is your beta, your voxels by features weight matrix, it doesn't look as random as this. It has some structure to it. And then when you take this covariance matrix of your features, you get some structure there, and now this is definitely not identity, and your assumptions are not met. One thing, I said that it assumes that the features are orthogonal. There's another assumption that is buried in there, which is that each feature is equally important. Also, definitely not true most of the time. So what effect does this have? We can show this with some simulations. So we simulate data that has different sort of rank of the feature matrix, of the sort of weight matrix. So we can go from high rank, where it's essentially identity, like RSA assumes, to very low rank, which is very blobby, like this. And we're varying the noise level here, so how much noise. This is just showing the RSA, the output, like the correlation of the response similarity matrix with the stimulus similarity matrix. And what you can see is that it's really dependent on the rank of the weight matrix here, right? So as you increase the rank of the weight matrix, it gets a bigger estimate. So essentially the differences between these things that have different noise levels, they get shrunk together when the features are very correlated, and they get spread apart when the features are not. And essentially this leads to lower statistical power in this situation where you have these correlations across features. Whereas if you do regression, if you actually fit the regression model and whatever, that's insensitive to the rank of the weight matrix. It doesn't care because you're just fitting each voxel independently and learning its weights. You're not making these strong assumptions about the relationships of the weights across voxels. So this is not the end of the world. So you lose a little bit of statistical power when you use RSA, fine. It's not a big deal. But, so a more common thing that people have been using RSA for recently is to compare different models. Right, you have one set of responses, and you have two different computational models. And you're asking, which of these two is a better model for this brain area? Right? Extremely common. You'll see this all the time in literature. What happens if one of those computational models actually better matches the assumptions of RSA than the other model? It turns out that inflates the RSA estimate for that model. Right? So one might be operating over here, and one might be operating over here, even though say one is actually more right than the other, right? So we've tested this with simulations. So this is showing where we generate two sets of features, one that's sort of the true features that were actually used to generate the data that we're testing on, and there's an alternate wrong features that were not used to generate the data, and then we're varying the similarity between Z and Y. So how close does this actually look to the data, and what the rank of these things are. And what happens is that there's actually a pretty big region of this space where RSA will choose the wrong model. Right? Even though this one is always closer to the true data. If you look at, this is the thing that was actually used to generate the true data. If you're in this region of space, if you have these low sort of rank weight matrices, then RSA can say that Z looks better than X, that Z is more correlated to Y than X is. And that's dangerous. Alternatively, if you use regression to do the same thing, then it always chooses the right model. And we also have an example with real data. So this is kind of a riff on an early paper that was looking at RSA. comparing in V1 Gabor features. So this is sort of decomposing an image into wavelets that really, is seemingly the correct model for V1. This is what electrophysiologists have talked about for decades. Is like this is actually what V1 does, versus object silhouettes. So this is just the boundaries of objects. So we have these two different feature representations of the stimulus, and we can actually there's a lot of parameters in how we choose this decomposition. So we can get few features or we can get many features. We can include a lot of high resolution stuff or not. Essentially, it's a choice that we make as experimenters when we're building these models. And so what happens is with RSA, if we use the small pyramids, this is like only using a few features, then it says that the Gabor model is better, that it's like a closer match to the V1 responses than the silhouette model. But if we use a large pyramid, which includes a lot of sort of high resolution information across the image, then RSA actually says that the silhouette model is better than the Gabor model. And this is just showing the difference between their sort of representational similarity values. And so this is because when you increase the size of the pyramid, you're adding a lot of noise. You're adding a lot of these small variance features that are not actually represented in the brain activity at all. You're adding a lot of crap that's not there. But RSA is assuming that these features are all represented, that they're all equally important for the representation. And that's corrupting what's happening here. But if you do regression, if you do this cross-validated regression, then it always gets the same answer, which is that the Gabor model is better than the silhouette model, which matches our half a century of electrophysiology results. So just want to conclude here. I'm sorry, I'm running over on time. I want to say that RSA is equivalent to an encoding model where you make extremely strong assumptions instead of actually fitting the weights. Hang on one sec. RSA has reduced statistical power when those assumptions aren't met. And when you compare models using RSA, this can literally just give you the wrong answer. So that's dangerous. All right, yes?
Really interesting. How much of this is dependent on using RSA where you sort of pre-combine the model into a single similarity matrix before you calculate correlation versus if you do like a multiple regression with like a similarity matrix from every single feature separately that can take on different weights?
So that second approach, this is like the mixed RSA, right? So that is actually mathematically equivalent to like fitting a regression model first and then essentially doing RSA on the weights that you fit to the regression model. That doesn't have any of these problems, as far as I know. So that's like, it's essentially, it's just equivalent to fitting the regression models. But I would argue that you're kind of throwing out high, per voxel information that you have. You're actually sort of implicitly computing this per voxel information, but then you're just throwing out by averaging across an area. But that's fine. I mean, it doesn't have these actual problems. So mixed RSA doesn't have these problems, and the other sort of recent method, pattern component modeling that's come out of Jorn Diedrichsen's group, that doesn't have these problems either. That seems to handle everything correctly. But sort of just the classic RSA applied in these kinds of approaches, I think, is problematic. So let me just close by thanking the people involved in this. Juanita here, super involved in the projects that I talked about first, and Amor Nunez did a lot of the RSA stuff, and then other folks, et cetera. Thank you.
A few questions for Alex. Also, if he's going to be around, so we can have plenty of time to debate and argue and learn.
Yeah.
So the language work is really wonderful, fascinating stuff. I wonder how much of it is language per se versus other cognitive operations that are provoked or indexed by the language. Is there any way of teasing those apart? Is this sort of
Sure, there is. I had a conversation with someone about this the other night. Mark. So my sort of back pocket idea of what's happening here is that it's mostly the latter. It's mostly that these are other cognitive operations that we are provoking with language. I think that's actually a real power of using language to study sort of cognition, is because it's a gateway into all these other things that we do with our brains, right? As soon as we have like cognitive abilities or things to think about, we come up with words to describe those things, and so it sort of necessarily gives us access to a lot or most or maybe all of the things that we can think about. There are ways to tease that apart. So you can carefully design, say, videos to evoke very specific things. You can do like non-linguistic tasks that are designed to provoke, again, very specific things. But that seems to be trickier and needs to be more targeted, whereas with language, we can just kind of scattershot like everything, and it kind of works.
So briefly, this might explain some of the like apparent differences between the sort of broad whole brain response you're getting in your model and previous cognitive work on language that has looked at linguistic operations per se and found them to be more tightly localized. Like there may not in fact be
that's fair, but I mean, there was plenty of linguistic work before too. When people look at, broadly at the semantic system or at like where semantics are represented, they see these same areas. Or like in meta-analyses, they see like all this stuff does something, but what does it do? It does this.
So in your semantic maps, which are super awesome looking, you said that one way of kind of seeing by eye that there's structure is that these maps are kind of spatially smooth. And I was wondering if you have a kind of intuition for like why, like you can imagine like maybe the real answer is like they're speckly, but is there like a functional reason why being smooth is good, or?
So I think yes. I think just based on the architecture of cortex, the neurons, like long wires are expensive and short wires, like sort of intracortical connections, are cheap, and like U fibers are cheap, and layer 1 connections are cheap. So that is going to bias, I think, cortex to computing things in sort of local-ish circuits rather than larger circuits. But that said, I think there's an incredible amount of information that we are not seeing here, right? So all this stuff that Jim showed yesterday about things that we know are present in visual cortex, like orientation domains and like ocular dominance domains and like color versus not color domains, whatever. All these things, like structured information like that, maybe not as structured as that. V1 seems to be kind of a special case, but there are probably many, many more representational dimensions that are kind of folded up into the fine structure of cortex in a lot of these areas that we just can't see with this resolution of data.
Do you think that smoothness is due to reducing the dimensionality to like a low number of dimensions with PCA, or do you think it's a real property of these like local circuit connections?
So, I mean, I think the fact that PCA pulls out stuff that is smooth, I don't think that can be an artifact of just doing PCA. It is pulling out like high variance things, and those things are correlated. That doesn't mean that even we're looking at 3 PCs here. They explain a small fraction of the total variance in these weights. If you just project the weights down onto those 3 PCs, you lose a lot of prediction performance, right? So there is a lot of fine structure in the complete weights that we have for each voxel that we're losing here, and that is probably much less smooth. Yeah.
So maybe I missed something, but so as I understand it, people who are proponents of the RSA approach say, well, there's something captured in the distributed nature of the voxels that's being missed in the voxel-wise approach. Like, how do you respond?
So so we can show actually, like mathematically, that what you're doing in RSA is you're implicitly fitting a model to every voxel. It's just a really dumb model that assumes that essentially everything is equally important. You can get the same broad detection of something there with voxel-wise regression as you can with RSA. You just like average your regression performance over a selection of voxels, right? That actually is exactly equivalent sort of test, but it tends to be more powerful if you don't account for the things that RSA is assuming. Yeah, so they're really equivalent. Like deeply, there are equivalencies between these things. It's RSA is it's not magic. It's like, yes, it's looking at patterns, but what it's doing under the hood actually looks exactly like regression. Andy. That's a really good question. I'm not quite sure. So it's not enough to just test the orthogonality of the features. You would need to test like actually fitting those features as a model and then test the orthogonality in the brain, right? Because the features might be orthogonal in your stimulus set, but not orthogonal in the brain. So the same, you have two features that might be, exactly, one is never on when the other is on, whatever. But when you actually look at it, the same voxels might respond to both of these things anyway, right? So there's no way to know until you actually fit that model and test it in the brain, which makes it tricky. But one thing that you can do, even if you don't have features, if you just have like a stimulus similarity matrix that you get through some operation, these are common things, you can convert those into features by doing an eigenvalue decomposition of that matrix. That gives you a set of features. That gives you exactly the same sort of corresponding features that you would get out if you had done some, came up with features first and then converted it into the similarity matrix.
All right, so let's thank Alex.